So welcome everybody to this webinar on decent work and living wage. We're going to start by just playing a short video while some people filter in.
Over the centuries, we have made drastic progress in raising our quality of life, but there is plenty of room for improvement. Because even today, billions of working people cannot afford a decent standard of living. Too many workers live in poverty. There's no question, ensuring a living wage for your workforce is good for business. It means happier, healthier lives, which in turn increases motivation, reduces staff turnover and absenteeism, and enhances your company's reputation to help attract and retain talent. That's why we need your action, commitment, and accountability now. Forward Faster is here to guide business doers like you in taking urgent action to ensure a living wage. We urge you to align with these two targets. Have 100% of your employees earn a living wage by 2030. Establish a joint action plan toward achieving living wages for all workers in your supply chain. What are you doing to ensure a living wage in your organization? Join thousands of leaders already committed to ensure the living wage moves forward faster.
So welcome again. Hopefully you were able to catch some, if not all of that video, just as a brief introduction. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. My name is Marianne Fletcher. I'm the founder and director of TCC. We've been working on living wage with the Global Compact for a couple of months now. We also have Aya Jaffa here, who is a labour economist with the ILO. Joe Ryan, who is VP of Assurance and Worker Welfare at Expo, and Adele Guidot, Program Lead from UN Global Compact Network, UAE. And I'll just let Adele give a brief introduction as well, and you'll obviously be hearing from our other speakers during the session.
Thank you, Maz, and a very good morning or afternoon maybe to everyone. It's a really great pleasure, to welcome you to today's session, as Marianne mentioned, talking about living wage. Just to provide a little bit of context to this task force that we will talk more about in the next few slides. But it was really initiated after a company in the UAE approached us, highlighting the need for a collaborative platform and the need to build capacity on living wages. And in parallel, we saw that the UAE's decent work more broadly landscape is moving forward, and living wage are a central part of that progress. And at the same time, at the Global Compact, we've launched the Forward Faster initiative, as you just saw in the video that we just showed. It was launched a few years back. And this really provides companies with a framework to take rapid, measurable action on 5 key issue areas that are recognized to accelerate contribution to the 17 SDGs and make the biggest impact by 2030, with living wages being one of those 5 key issue areas. So this is really how this platform came to life. And through this task force, the aim and the objective is to really bring business together to foster dialogue, share practical insights, and also build capacity, as mentioned, not just on living wage, but across 4 pillars that we've identified to be relevant and strategic to the UAE and the decent work, being productive and fair income, health and safety, ethical employment standards, and sustainable procurement. So I'll leave it there because we will take you through all of that in the next few slides. I'll also like, obviously, to welcome Aya and Joe. It's a real honor to have you part of today's conversation, and we hope that this task force is just the beginning of a lot of collaboration across the UAE business community.
Thank you, Adele. So just a little overview of our agenda today. So we have a bit of welcoming and context setting, as we've just gone over. We'll be looking at mobilizing the UAE business community and what that looks like, as Adele mentioned, with the task force. Aya is going to be sharing some insights on calculating a living wage and the methodology that the ILO has behind that. Joe is going to be sharing a perspective from business and the practices that he's been implementing at Expo City to introduce living wage into their practices there. We'll be sharing a little bit of guidance on how you as a company can take this forwards, and then we'll leave some space, some time at the end for discussion and Q&A. So if you do have any questions, then please feel free to drop them in the chat throughout the meeting or at the end there. So just to kind of give a bit more context to this, Adele mentioned that we're looking at decent work and these 4 pillars here. So the decent work is defined by the ILO as encompassing opportunities for work that are productive and deliver a fair income, security in the workplace, social protection, personal development, social integration, freedom of expression, and equality of opportunity. And this is a core component of the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 8, which is aiming for inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. Within this kind of task force, we're looking at these 4 pillars, which Adele mentioned briefly, which are productive and fair income, health and safety, ethical employment standards, and sustainable procurement. So this first one around productive and fair income links to the living wage agenda that we are talking about today, and hopefully we can bring you some more conversations around the other 3 pillars in the future. So what is a living wage? I don't want to get into this too much because I know that there are much more qualified people than me to speak about this on this call. But just briefly, a living wage is the wage level that is necessary to afford a decent standard of living for workers and their families, taking into account the country circumstances and calculated for the work performed during normal hours. That's the definition provided by the ILO. And when we're looking at living wage, we might want to be looking at things like childcare, the cost of food, the cost of healthcare in the country, housing, internet and mobile costs, transportation, something that is often, I think, overlooked, which is civic engagement, which is the cost of your ability to engage with the local community and do things like access education, reading, and other hobbies. And then other necessities like clothing, personal care products, and housekeeping supplies. So that's a very brief overview as to what a living wage is. Globally, there is a lot more conversation about this. Unfortunately, still many workers are being paid below the minimum wage globally due to restrictive policies and non-compliance. I think that goes for most countries around the world. There are still people not earning the minimum wage. However, there is a more recognition that earning a decent living is beneficial for everybody. So customer loyalty, we're seeing more customers are willing to pay for companies that are demonstrating social impact, including paying their workforce effectively. There's also pressure from investors who see living wage and employment as being a key factor in their decision-making for finance. In terms of sourcing talent, 75% of workers say that they would switch to an employer paying the real living wage. And we see companies that have fair wages are demonstrating a higher level of employee happiness and motivation in their teams. So overall, it's good for business, it's good for employees. Within the UAE, we are seeing kind of mixed practice at the moment. So it's not mandated that there is a living wage. However, there's lots of discussions happening and there's a real space for leadership emerging with more scrutiny growing and different regulations pushing for these things within ESG framework. So currently, the UAE does not have a mandate for a national living wage. Minimum wages exist, but only for certain groups, for example, domestic workers, Emirati nationals in the private sector. Wage levels are regulated through labour contracts and visa categories, but they're not necessarily tied to a universal benchmark or tied to the cost of living, which we've seen has varied quite a lot over the past few years. And wage and living costs also vary significantly across the Emirates, as we know, and so it's not necessarily easy to define a living wage for the whole country. From businesses' side, most businesses are adhering to legal minimum and contractual obligations, but few are benchmarking to actual household costs, and that's why we've pulled this task force together, because we feel there is a need for that to be happening. Some multinational companies are beginning to adopt voluntary wage commitments, and this is largely driven by global ESG strategies. And we understand that local SMEs do face cost pressures and may not typically go beyond compliance. For workers, migrant workers who make up a large majority of the workforce, are kind of earning varying wages and not always enough to meet their basic needs, and sometimes may have to rely on house sharing, loans, or excessive overtime in order to meet their costs. We know that there are rising living costs, particularly in Dubai, in terms of housing, food, and this is something that's obviously happening globally as well, and it can impact low-wage workers. So there is a real momentum for change at the moment. We're seeing growing attention from investors, international clients, and multilateral organizations on the decent work and wage transparency agenda. And there are discussions underway in the UAE in business forums about aligning with the Global Living Wage Initiative. So we basically want to say there is a big opportunity here for early adopters to lead, to improve retention in your organization, and to enhance the reputation by joining us to set living wage policies in your organization. I will hand over now to Adele to speak more about mobilizing the UAE business community.
Thank you. And perhaps just before speaking to, mobilizing the business community, we really wanted also to provide a bigger picture and really emphasize that living wages are not a side issue. So starting from there and then getting to the business community, but living wages are really central to reducing inequalities, tackling poverty, and driving inclusive growth. And that's really why they are one of the 5 priority areas of the UNGC's Forward Faster initiative, really calling, as mentioned, on companies to take bold action where businesses can make the biggest difference by 2030. And so what we've seen is the numbers show that over the last 20 years, inequality between countries has decreased, but income inequality within countries has increased, affecting more than 2/3 of the global population. The top 10% of earners receive 52% of total global pay, while the lowest paid half of workers earn only 8.5%. And then if we look at the wealth concentration, the richest 10% own over 3/4 of global wealth, and the poorest 50% own only 2% of it. So rising inequality is a major barrier to achieving the SDGs, and specifically SDG 1, 5, 8, and 10 that you can see on the right side of the screen. There's a real they are directly linked. Living wage directly impact no poverty, gender equality, decent work, and reduced inequality, which is why it's important to look at it also from that broader perspective. If we can move to the next slide. So understanding this really sets the stage for the reality many workers face today. And despite economic growth, millions are still trapped in low pay and in-work poverty. And decent work really begins with wages. Employment alone is not enough if pay does not allow workers to live with dignity. And today, 1 in 3 workers globally earn less than what they need for a basic standard of living, which is really a stark reminder that work does not always lift people out of poverty. And obviously, this is where businesses has a significant role to play in that. And so despite global growth in wages that we've seen, millions remain in low pay and in work poverty, including within the supply chain. As mentioned, 1 in 3 workers earn below what's needed for a decent standard of living. And while productivity has increased, wages have not kept pace. So what this means is that workers are receiving a shrinking share of the value they actually create. This is a global phenomenon cutting across sectors and countries. And if, when we speak with companies, they do what they can, of course, to make sure that it does not happen in the operations, but then it's also important to look at the value chain. And this is where we also emphasize that because of that, it is a global phenomenon. And so, of course, businesses have both a key role and responsibility to act, ensuring fair pay directly and across, as mentioned, the supply chain. Now, if we can move to the next slide. So addressing working poverty is not just a social imperative. We come, speaking about the SDGs and the UN's mandate, but there's obviously also a clear business case as well, which we will explore in that slide. So paying fair wages is not only the right thing to do, as mentioned, it really makes sound business sense. Marianne spoke a little bit to that in the previous slides, but companies that invest in living wages often see measurable benefits in productivity, retention, and reputation, really demonstrating that ethical business and strategic advantage really go hand in hand. So we've seen, for example, lower staff turnover, which reduces recruitment, onboarding, and training cost. We see that this allows a more motivated and productive workforce, which improves morale and commitment. It also leads to greater economic security and health, which enhances employee satisfaction, contributing to better productivity and workplace environment. We've also seen early evidence that living wages can improve revenues and profits. It is integral to responsible sourcing strategies as well. We see also more and more in the UAE roles being created under procurement, where we look at it from a sustainable standpoint, which strengthen the value chain stability, performance, and resilience. And there is a direct correlation between supplier performance and treatment of workers, where fair pay drives better outcomes. And we have a few numbers on the right side of the screen, where we've seen that 93% experience benefits for their business, 86 report improved reputation, 75% report increased motivation and retention rates for employees, 64% say accreditation has helped differentiate them in their industry, and 58% report improved relation between managers and staff. This comes from Global Compact related numbers. Now, if we can move to the next slide. So linking all of that back to Forward Faster, which really is the North Star for us at the Global Compact when it comes to corporate commitment. As mentioned, it really provides a roadmap for accelerating living wage adoption, if we look at living wage specifically. And it was really designed to help businesses maximize impact quickly and strategically. And living wages, as mentioned, is one of the core targets. Living wage are one of its core target areas because they address both worker well-being and the long-term sustainability of business operations. So we have two targets on the living wage Forward Faster. It's obviously a voluntary initiative, and companies can choose to commit to either target 1, target 2, or both targets. Target 1 is really about 100% of employees across the organization earn living wage by 2030. And target 2 is looking at establishing a joint action plan with contractors, supply chain partners, and other key stakeholders to work towards achieving living wages and or living income with measurable and time-bound milestones. So one of the key, it's one of the deliverables that we hope to sort of achieve also through this task force is to increase corporate commitment to these two targets. It's not an obligation, but it also serves, as mentioned, as some sort of roadmap for businesses to understand how they can further navigate and commit to living wages. If we can move to the next slide. So about the task force itself. The UAE Living Wage Task Force is really a collaborative working group that enables companies to explore, share, and implement pathway towards living wages while aligning with broader SDG and sustainability goals. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but we took a recently, not a different direction, but we've expanded this task force to decent work. But with living wage, of course, remaining one of the central key deliverables or focus of the decent work task force. But if we look at decent living wages specifically, the aim of this working group really aims to support companies to develop living wage estimates and consider pathway towards ensuring 100% of employees earn a living wage by 2030, so linking to target 1 of Forward Faster. The aim is to also shape industry standards, so share insights and co-develop industry-specific frameworks. So we know that from one industry to another, there may be factors that will affect how we reach living wages within the company. And the aim is to tap into different sectors within the UAE to understand what potential standards could look like. So the aim is to really engage companies within the same sectors, but also have a cross-sectoral approach. A third objective is to engage supply chains. So more linked to target 2 of Forward Faster, which is really about establishing, as mentioned, action plans with contractors, suppliers, and key stakeholders. And then last but not least, drive thought leadership and potentially publish a UAE living wage report with key findings and case studies, showcasing best practices from companies to lead the way forward. And what we also want to share is that, as mentioned, it's a collaborative approach to understand what living wage could look like locally in the UAE and really share information around pathways for implementing these policies in alignment with the SDGs and broader sustainability goals. What we are not is an advocacy group, nor do we have a predetermined answer for living wage amount or implementation pathway. So this is we really want to make sure that we are not advocating for living wages. We just want to create a space, a safe space for companies to share knowledge, build capacity, and then this would lead to potentially shaping industry standards and UAE specific best practices.
Thank you, Adele. We'll now move on to Aya, who will be sharing the ILO's methodology for calculating a living wage and how the ILO will be working with us on this task force.
Thank you very much, Maz and Adele, for the introductions, and hello, everyone. So I'll be presenting ILO's approach to living wages. I'll start with the definition of a living wage. I think this was already presented by Maz briefly, but maybe before I go further into this, I'd like to mention that the concept of living wage is not new. It exists for more than a decade now. It's in the ILO's Constitution of 1919. It's in the Philadelphia Declaration of 1944. But an official definition was only reached, unfortunately, last year after the meeting of experts on wage policies, including living wages, that took place, and that defines a living wage as the wage level that is necessary to afford a decent standard of living for workers and their families, taking into account, of course, the country circumstances and calculated for the work performed during the normal hours of work. So a worker should not be forced to work overtime to be able to get a living wage. And then the second important thing is that it should be calculated in accordance with ILO's principles of estimating the living wage, and I'll get to that later in my presentation, and achieved through a wage setting process, also in line with ILO principles on wage setting. And this is very crucial because this should be done through, the right mechanisms of social dialogue, of collective bargaining, taking into account not only the needs of workers and their families, but also economic factors in a given country. We really need to understand the situation in a given country. If there are low wages or low pay, what are the reasons behind that? Is it high levels of informality, low levels of productivity, lack of skills, etc.? So all of this is needed to really understand the situation before we jump into a conclusion and before saying that companies have to pay this living wage. Next slide, please. Now, why a living wage? This has also been discussed before. First, because there is a realization that workers, despite working, they still live with their families in poverty. We have more than 90% of countries around the world implementing minimum wages, but yet these wages are not sufficient to lift them and their families out of poverty. It's a concept that, of course, operationalizes the fair remuneration component of decent work. For the ILO, decent work is work that's productive, that provides security and safety to workers and provides them with enough for a decent life. So this is why a living wage is important. And of course, the living wage is not only important for workers, but also for businesses. And it was also discussed extensively. It boosts productivity, reduces turnover, fosters innovation, and enhances brand and reputation of businesses. Next slide, please. Yeah. So how to measure living wages? The ILO has developed a very detailed methodology, step-by-step methodology on how to estimate the needs of workers and their families. And basically, the first step is to estimate what we call a basket of goods. And this basket of goods has 4 components, as you see on the slide. So we have food, housing, health and education, and other essentials that are also agreed upon in consultation, of course, with local experts and workers and employers representatives, etc. The methodology is very clear on what data sources we use, what methodology we use, what approaches we use. Sometimes we use normative approaches, especially like for food and housing. We have very well established international guidelines set by international organizations, so we follow that. For other components, we use relative approaches, but all of these components are basically measured using also data from household income and expenditure surveys. And this is why this is, I think, one of the main characteristics of the ILO's methodology is that we build on existing data that's representative at the national level. It's household income and expenditure survey. And then we, of course, need to make some assumptions around I think Maz or whoever is controlling the slide. Yes, thank you. And then we need to make some assumptions on the family size and the number of workers. So the bigger the family size, obviously, the bigger, the higher the living wage is needed, and we also, of course, need to make assumptions about the number of workers in a household. These assumptions, again, have to be also evidence-based. In the ILO's methodology, our assumption is that the family size has to be equal to the national average, and the number of workers is assumed to be equal to 1.5. Of course, again, these assumptions could be adapted to local context, national context, and agreed upon in consultation with local experts and workers and employers organizations. Next slide, please. So once these are identified, calculated, we just need to calculate this basket of goods that's calculated for one person multiplied by the total number of people in one household divided by the total number of working adults, and we get the living wage. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned the principles for estimating living wages, and we basically have 10 principles. The first one is that the estimation needs to be done through evidence-based methodologies, and this is why we often work with data that's provided by national statistical offices, and household income and expenditure surveys are, of course, one source of such data. The methodology should also be adapted to local context and discussed and consulted with representatives of workers and employers organizations. We have to be transparent about data sources and methodologies. And this is, again, why our methodology is very clear on what data sources we are using, what methods we are following, etc. Have robust and representative data. If it's at the national level, it has to be representative at the national level. If it's a local level, at the sectoral level, whatever our representation target is, we have to be very clear that our data is robust and representative. It should be, of course, made timely. It should be, of course, made available, not only the estimates, but also the data and methodologies that we have used. We need to specify whether our estimates are net or gross. We need to update and adjust our estimates on a regular basis. And when we use ILO's methodology, for instance, the household income and expenditure surveys are usually regularly conducted, but not on a yearly basis. So when these household income and expenditure surveys are not available, we have to adjust taking into account cost of living or inflation, and then we can update once a new household income and expenditure survey is made available. We need, of course, technical review at the national level, promote gender equality and non-discrimination, and most importantly, of course, take into account local context and, adapt this methodology to the national context. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I'm happy to mention that the ILO has launched a new program on living wages earlier this year, and the main purpose was to basically support our constituents in estimating or calculating living wages, but also in operationalizing the concept of a living wage. The program has two pillars. The first pillar is on the estimation of living wages, and the idea is to eventually create a wage data hub at the ILO. At the moment, this data hub does not exist, but we want to have this database where we have data on living wages, but also, minimum wages, economic factors as well, because this has also to be taken into account, and other wage-related data. And then on the other hand, we also aim to provide technical assistance to our constituents to help them operationalize the concept of a living wage, again, taking into account the needs of workers and the economic factors in a given country. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide to mention that we also have a very important initiative, the Living Wage Initiative, which was established under the Global Coalition for Social Justice. It's one of the 15 living wage initiatives that were created under this global coalition. And the idea of this initiative is to basically create a platform where partners of the initiative could, interact, share knowledge, exchange information, and promote alignment with ILO conclusions. The idea is also to learn from the experiences of government, social partners, living wage initiatives, and estimating and operationalizing living wages. And finally, to exchange information on existing ILO's work on living wage initiatives, as well as other initiatives and activities run and conducted by other stakeholders. And I guess this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. And back to you, Marianne.
Thank you so much, Aya. That was great. Next, we'll be hearing from Joe about the business voice and lessons from practice. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks, Adele and Aya. Yeah, so I've got a few slides here. I'll just give you a bit of an oversight, really, from our position as a business operator at Expo City Dubai. It's obviously a pleasure to speak to you today. It's a very important subject, the living wage and decent work. And we're here to share how our worker welfare program at Expo City brings this principle to life. So if we can flick to the next slide, please. So the UN Global Compact's Think Lab on living wages played a defining role in elevating how businesses lead on living wage practices, emphasising that paying a living wage is about ensuring decent work, which we spoke about, so SDG 8, and also respecting human dignity, which really is reflected, I guess, in SDG 1, so no poverty. It was brought to light, I guess, in 2019, certainly through my research, that over 630 million workers worldwide, so roughly 19% of the global workforce, did not earn enough to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. Maybe the data that Marianne shared earlier, which was 266 million of global workers, we're actually heading in the right direction, and there's a lot of good work going on. But the 19% of the global workforce then clearly did not earn enough to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. And underscored how minimum wage laws often fall short. So the Think Lab really reinforced businesses' obligations under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that companies must recognise low pay risks through human rights due diligence and leverage their influence to promote living wages through their business and their supply chains. If we can flick on to the next slide, and the next two slides, I'll start to talk about what we're doing here at Expo City and how it aligns really to these frameworks. A lot of our work will be centred around our worker welfare programme. They're certainly fully aligned to the principles that we've been talking about and those of the UN Global Compact. In terms of defining a living wage, we're obviously just talking much more than a number. It is the difference between a family living paycheck to paycheck and one where parents can confidently feed their children healthy meals, they can live in a safe home, they can access medical care without worry, they can send their kids to school, they can still have a small cushion for eventualities and emergencies on a day-to-day basis. But it really means dignity, stability, and the chance for families to truly thrive. So meeting the minimum wage is the bare minimum legal requirement, which I'm sure we all appreciate and are fully aware of, but it shouldn't define our ambition. Okay, we go further, ensuring that wages uplift lives and bring dignity to work and to provide real stability within families. Of course, at Expo City, our commitment goes much deeper than what we're showing on the slides here. Expo City, as it is now, has really sort of grown through the days of when Expo 2020 was formed. And throughout that process, probably over the last 7 years, at least maybe 8 years and beyond, we've examined every layer of our operations ourselves, but we also look at every aspect of our contractor and supplier operations, certainly on the worker welfare front. And we identify and spot whether low pay threatens the rights of and well-being of the workers. But we don't just stop there. We don't just identify risks. We work with our contractors and our supply chain to mitigate those risks. Not saying that it's easy and we've got everything right, but we work extremely hard with our contractors, with our suppliers and the supply chain as a whole to mitigate those risks. We try to use our influence wisely. We're very active in engaging our partners. We have very strong auditing practices, and we try to build capacity, which ensures that living wages are not only promised but delivered across the entire value chain. We regularly review our contractor wage structures. I wouldn't say that we go into detail of every single role and what they're paid, but we do have a threshold in terms of a minimum threshold where our worker welfare program actively is triggered, and then that leads to setting action plans, continuous improvement goals and tracking progress over time. But it does involve taking a look in terms of the payment structure and wage payments. The wage payments themselves are auditable, so we do look at those very closely and we make sure that they're compliant with the UAE labour law and our own Expo City specific worker welfare standards. We don't allow any contractor or supplier to work here at Expo City unless they're signing up to those standards. The wage structures within that are then clearly defined and reviewed annually through our auditing process, and we ensure fairness, transparency and accountability. We set standards to ensure our workers receive employment offers and contracts that match in their language that they understand, whether it's written or verbal, that they're protecting them from either coercion and unfavourable terms. So we do look at the contract process, the recruitment process and so on, and make sure that that's fair and that the terms are favourable. And we also ensure that workers benefit from the full protection of the UAE labour law, including age restrictions and ECD specific requirements. Signed contracts cannot, and we don't allow them to be substituted with less favourable terms without the worker consent. Okay, next slide. Delving a little bit deeper then in terms of some of the activities that we undertake. I've mentioned our programme. We do have a very strong and very active assurance programme within our overall worker welfare programme and framework. We undertake regular reviews of our employer practices. The standards themselves are widely shared across Expo City and our workforce, but also through our supply chain. The standards are shared with our suppliers at the tender stage, and they have to sign a commitment they will meet those standards before contracts are awarded and throughout that procurement process. From that process, that's where we do gain and develop action plans and look for continuous improvement. We work closely with our trusted partner, Gratia Advisory, who advise ourselves on the standards that require the labour law and assist us in delivering that worker welfare programme. Throughout the programme, then, we look at ensuring full wage protection, so looking at zero recruitment fees and that workers retain their full compensation. We look at elements for compliance with the labour law, such as working hours, rest and leave, to make sure that the workforce do not exceed the maximum working hours of 8 hours per day or 48 hours per week, that working hours are recorded and attendance is recorded, and where overtime is worked, then it's compensated correctly, recorded correctly and paid correctly. And we also make sure that all of those records, such as rest, annual leave, sick leave, bereavement leave, and so on, are maintained, and we check all of that detail. As part of our process as well, we look at the complementary support services to make sure they include accommodation, include food, healthcare, all obviously aimed at reducing living costs and amplifying their wage impact. So our standards set out to set a requirement for comprehensive healthcare, as well as medical care and medical assistance. This includes occupational health cards, it includes free access to health insurance and free access to medical health care, both on site and within their labour accommodation. And then costs for work-related injuries and diseases are also covered, and we expect those to be covered, and also counselling services provided within that as well. So you can see how a lot of the services that we look for and provision is also targeted towards stability and dignity as well. We're very active, I would say, on the workforce engagement side as well. We have a number of activities that we undertake. We expect our contractors and our employers to hold worker welfare committees on a monthly basis, which does require attendance from their subcontractors. 4 times a year, we deliver worker welfare forums where we wrap those up under a banner called Better Together. And we deliver those to our contractors, our service providers, and our contract owners here at ECD. So we get direct engagement with our supply chain, so we can drive standards that way. Equally, at the end of the year, we run a Better Together award ceremony so we can recognise good practice and encourage others to follow suit as well. We give out a number of awards, both individually and collectively, to recognise their achievements and the hard work that they've put into their programmes. So after all of this, then there's obviously continuous supplier collaboration. We send out communication regularly on a monthly basis to continually seek those improvements and raise standards throughout. So it's not always targeted at the wage itself, it's targeted at the whole of the worker welfare programme practices which contribute towards the living wage, the dignity and everything we've been talking about. And I would say, last but not least, what we do is hold all of our contractors, our supply chain and ourselves to account on all of these standards. We meet with our contractors on a monthly basis, so where we carry out our auditing function, we have points of contact within the supply chain and within our worker welfare team, and they meet on a monthly basis to close out the actions that we've identified and improve standards throughout the year. Okay, then on to our final slide. Just to wrap it all up, really, that's probably fairly obvious to everybody, but there's benefits and business rationale behind all of this. The benefits there are clear to see. It boosts worker well-being, it boosts morale, it boosts attrition rates and retention of your workforce. Productivity we expect to then increase and reduce turnover-related costs. We certainly aim to build trust and resilience throughout our supply chain, and I think that's certainly been evident over the 2 years that I've been here at Expo City and the 7 years of Expo 2020 and Expo City as it is now. It does strengthen position and reputation as a socially responsible city, and that is really, really important to ourselves. You'll see all of our marketing that goes out that we're advertising ourselves as being a sustainable city, an accessible city, human-centric. All of what I spoke about is behind all of that, and we have this as a real priority for our city, and we roll that out through our suppliers as well and expect them to adopt the same. And ultimately, it contributes towards meaningfully to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, as we've already spoken about today. So the Think Lab and UN Global Compact concludes really paying a living wage is not just about cost. It's an investment, as we know. It's about human capital, it's about operational resilience, and it's alignment with human rights standards. So just to close, really, the insights from the UN Global Compact's Think Lab and living wage, and obviously what I've sort of talked about, is to provide sort of both moral clarity and practical guidance on the living wage, which we feel is a central component of decent work and human rights due diligence. So here at Expo City, our worker welfare programme stands as a powerful manifestation of these principles, and we're driving that forward. Just a few details. What I haven't spoke about is our standards are built up of, obviously we aim for 100% compliance, but we add 40% of international best practice onto those standards. We don't just sit on the compliance level. We are trying to drive standards quite hard across the city here and through our supply chain. And the aim there is obviously to work with our contractors and our suppliers to improve their standards and hopefully, make everybody's lives better. So ultimately, just to say that by embedding obviously living wage policies, investing in our worker welfare, and extending these standards throughout our supply chain, we uphold human dignity, and we aim to build a stronger, more inclusive community. That's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much, Joe. It was a fantastic example of how living wage standards can be implemented across organizational level, a city level, and throughout your supply chain. So thank you very much for that. We would just want to close quickly before jumping to Q&A, that is, on some practical guidance for companies who may be interested in adopting living wage standards in your organization. And so there is a toolkit that is provided by the UN Global Compact, which I'll just let Adele speak to briefly. Just to note, if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them either in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll be getting to those just after this.
Thank you, and thank you, Joe. Echoing Marianne's words, it's great to see how everything is put into practice from Expo City example, and we know that there are a lot of other companies doing, similarly in the UAE. But it's great to hear from you, and we hope that this task force will also encourage more company to lead the way as well. But back to the tool. So as mentioned, the UN Global Compact launched a wage assessment tool. Essentially, it's really a free, user-friendly, and strictly confidential online tool that helps companies identify actions and further opportunities to provide a living wage. It's free, so you can use it today. It's a good first step to understand where you stand. And what's important to note as well is that it's grounded in international labor standards of the ILO and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. It's business driven, as it was developed through the UN Global Compact Think Lab on living wage, which was made of companies and organizations leading on the topic. And the questions are really based on real life company practice, international standards, and indicators. And essentially, it helps companies assess current policies and programs. So questions will be around that, highlight areas for improvement, and identify opportunities to set future corporate goals and targets. And then if we move to the next slides, we can see that results are provided in a concise and clear format, so companies can easily identify areas of improvement. You can see that there are 9 different type of pillars when it comes to question. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it on the tool. If you have any question, please feel free to reach out to us. Maybe what we can do as well, if we aim to send a follow-up email, send the link to the tool. If not, you can also just reach out to us and we will be happy to share that. But this also obviously complement the task force with other, hands-on capacity building that will be provided to companies together with the Climate Club. And then also, such as today, hearing from Expo City Dubai, this is the type of platform and space that we want to create for living wages and more broadly decent work.
Thank you, Adele. I'm just going to go out of the presentation so I can see any questions that are coming through.
We received 2 questions, it seems, already.
Excellent. So I think if I go, yeah, okay. Question number 1. This is great. Thanks for sharing. However, I struggle to see how a living wage could be estimated for the UAE, where there are people making 800 dirhams a month and others making 120k a month. So we've spoken about how the standard that the wages in this country vary significantly depending on types of workers, the location of the workers. Maybe Aya, you could give a bit of a reflection from ILO's perspective on how to do this kind of estimation.
Thank you for this question. Thank you, Maz. I mean, again, the living wage is estimated based on the needs of workers and their families. And when we talk about the living wage, we're not saying that every single worker in the country should be earning this amount of income. On the contrary, we welcome and we would like to see more workers earning more than the living wage, of course, but at least ensuring that most of the workers or all the workers earn a living wage to enable themselves and their families to live in dignity. And again, I can share the methodology of the ILO on how to estimate or how to calculate the living wage, and that provides you with a step-by-step, provides you with a step-by-step approach to calculating this living wage. At the end of the day, we would still have a wage structure in the country. Of course, not everyone will be earning the living wage. It depends on the sectors, on the regions as well. And this is why local context, sectoral context, occupational context, etc., have to be taken into account. Otherwise, it's really difficult to apply, to have one wage across the country.
Thank you, Aya. Joe, I wonder if from Expo's perspective, how did you look at the varying wages in the country and try and come up with a number for your city?
Yeah, I mean, we know obviously there isn't a minimum wage here in the country, but the estimate is around about 3,000 to 5,000 dirham per month. So our worker welfare standard is based on a threshold of 4,000 dirham a month, and what that does, that activates our worker welfare program. So every contractor, every service provider has to adhere to our program if they fall below, have workers that fall below that threshold. And then that exposes them to our standards, our auditing program, and so on. And then that's where we have those regular touch points with them. They're scrutinised then, quite considerably. And what we do then is, if it's a larger company, anything over more than 50 employees, they're subject to the full compliance audit, which has 300 items that we audit them against. And what we do then is create the action plan and then the continuous improvement to try to bring up those standards. So we have lengthy conversations. But yeah, I mean, a lot of our standards are born from Expo 2020. So probably they started and were evolved probably around about sort of 2017, 2016 when they were first written. And we've continued to evolve them that way. We haven't really, since I've been here, moved the threshold up, but we're obviously trying to make sure we're aligned to federal law and to ILO standards and so on. And we'll continue to do that.
Thank you, Joe. Adele, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
No, nothing to add.
Thank you, David, for the question. I think just to reiterate that, obviously, we're not necessarily trying to, we're trying to come at this together collaboratively. And it's so great to have companies like Expo City who have already done this kind of calculation, but equally people who are still thinking about it, and to come up with something and kind of tackle the problem collaboratively from a business perspective. So I think it's good that we have, the more data points we have, the more we can come up with a number that we think is reasonable. And we don't promise to come with all of the answers. It's definitely a process. Another question here. I agree that low pay can contribute to forced labour. Thank you for the session. How does the ILO decent wage method apply in the UAE, especially for migrant workers, considering remittances, local costs and informal work? Also, are there any research reports or references, such as from the Anchor Foundation, that we can review? Aya, back to you on this one, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, just to say that the ILO's methodology is not meant to provide one solution to everyone. So it's not a one size fits all. And this is why it has to be adaptable to the local context. So we have the baseline assumptions, we have the baseline methods, but then we have to discuss them at the local level to see how they're implemented. And obviously the UAE has its own labor market structure, including the large amount and number of migrant workers. And but maybe just to go back to one of the principles that I've also mentioned, and that was gender equality and non-discrimination. So when we talk about non-discrimination, we also talk about non-discrimination between migrant workers and nationals. So ideally, we would want to have one living wage that applies to both nationals and non-nationals without discrimination. So it won't differ if we're talking about a national worker or a non-national worker. We will still have the same living wage estimate, but then we can account for the migrant specific realities, if I may say. So if they get some protections, if they get some if the employer pays something specifically, and this, like if the employer pays for the housing of the migrant worker, for food, transport, etc., and these provisions are of quality, of course, we can then deduct it from the living wage estimate. But that doesn't mean that we would have two separate living wages, one for migrant workers and one for nationals. At the end of the day, the living wage is estimated based on local costs for all workers, again, without discrimination. And you mentioned informal work. This is exactly why we also need to take into account the root causes of low pay. If the root cause is informality, then we need not only to include measures to improve wages in the country, but also to address the issue of informality. Skills, again, is the same thing. We need to include measures to address skills issues. So it's not, again, it's not a one size fits all. It has to be, again, developed in consultation with the local experts, workers and employers organization, to make sure that we are really accounting for everything that's relevant for the country context and its labor market situation. And on the reference reports, I can definitely share with you the ILO's methodology. We also have a compendium of economic factors that can also help you identify what other variables and indicators we look at when we get to the operationalization of living wage. So you estimate it based on the needs of families and their workers and their families, and then to operationalize it, you also have to take into account another number of indicators and variables that I have not presented in the report, but they should be really considered. So I'll share these two documents with you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Back to you.
Adele, did you have something to add there?
Just to add on that from the perspective of the task force, but this is also why one of the reasons somehow that the task force was brought to life, because obviously the UAE is home to a lot of migrant workers. So we wanted to make sure that this is also reflected in the way we approach living wages, and back also to the sector specific standards. We know that certain sectors will hire more migrant workers, for example, construction, which is why there's an idea also to look at sector-specific standards. So it's an ongoing, as Marianne mentioned as well, it's an ongoing process. We don't have answers to everything. Obviously, the ILO also is working on that. We have a page at the UNGC that provides a lot of resources around living wages. Lots of references are made to the ILO as well. So I'll just go ahead and share it in the chat. But there's already a lot of available resources, courses, reports, and other resources that you can look at as a first step as well. And I also shared the living wage assessment tool already in the chat. So now I will share the full resources.
Thank you, Adele. So we have another question from Simon. If a living wage is linked to the size of the family and the number of working adults within a household, does this create an incentive for organizations who want to pay a living wage to employ single people as they have a lower living cost? Is this a concern? It's a very interesting question. Anyone? I'll open that to the floor. Anyone want to jump in there?
I mean, I can briefly answer this question to say that the assumptions that we employ have to be evidence-based. So we can't just say that we want to adopt this assumption. We have to be, our assumption has to be defendable, and our approach would be, and our, recommendation would be to basically use the national average and then discuss again with. So it's not really up to the organization to decide what number of members in the household exist. It's really up to the national group of experts and who are working on this methodology to agree on this. We don't want at the end of the day to have different living wage estimates, but one that's really based on evidence and that can be defendable and accepted also by local constituents and experts.
I will maybe add as well that I think there is a marriage allowance or people who are married get more, and Simon, you'll know much more about this than I will as a recruiter, but I don't know how much influence that has on companies when they're hiring, whether they hire people who are single because they don't have to pay that additional allowance. But as I say, you're probably the expert on that one. And yeah, any other thoughts on that question?
If I may add that sometimes we use scenarios that if there is one, if it's a one member in the household too, so you have different scenarios and different estimates that you can apply. But in general, again, it has to be based on evidence.
Right. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, just from our side of things, I mean, our standards are probably, we hold those as equal to like federal law. So contractors and suppliers, employers have to adhere to those standards. So I think the answer to a lot of that question is yes, it could be a concern. However, we write the detail into the standards. The contractor and supplier then have to adhere to those standards at the procurement stage. We audit them and then we rate them. And if they fall into the lowest category, they cannot proceed on the procurement stage, i.e. they don't get awarded contracts and so on. So yes, it doesn't necessarily change standards directly, but we use that process to uplift those standards so they meet our requirements, and therefore we kind of de-risk it that way and try to improve everybody, the supply chain standards as a whole. So we basically link our standards to contracts. And if they are here already, when we audit them, if they fall and drop back below the standards and take their eye off the ball and change standards and so on, we'll know about it, and then we link that to contracts and we drive those standards, because nobody really wants to lose their contracts as well. So we use it in that sense, which hopefully will avoid that situation arising. And particularly we would write in our standards that they wouldn't be able to employ single people just because of that basis of families.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for what I think has been a very productive and interesting conversation. We're just over an hour, so I will let everyone get back to their meetings and day. But thank you very much, Adele, Joe, and Aya for joining in this talk. And we would just like to say, if anyone is interested in learning more about the task force, then please feel free to reach out either to myself or to Adele. And I'm sure you can find Joe and Aya as well. I'm sure they'd be open to discussing a bit more with you if you're interested in learning about living wage. But yes, if you're interested in the task force, please reach out to us. And thank you so much for joining, and hopefully you'll have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Great to see you all.